Hello, my name is Julie Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Identity Defined Security Alliance. I want to thank you for joining us today. Zero Trust has been gaining momentum over the last several years as organizations in both the public and private sector struggle with how to secure a dissolving network perimeter. And then almost overnight, the pandemic forced the world online like never before. Organizations across the private and public sector and almost all industries suddenly had employees working remotely, accessing corporate resources from home computers and personal devices, which opened up the door to bad actors finding more ways into an organization. It drove the need to build defenses with the idea that the bad actors were already present, which is a core tenet of Zero Trust. This buzz around Zero Trust, which had been building for the last several years, became even more intense with the recent presidential executive order mandating a Zero Trust approach to security for government agencies. In addition to the government mandate, the private sector is fully embracing Zero Trust. In fact, research published by the IDSA in June found that 93% of security leaders considered Zero Trust strategic for securing their organization. So today, the IDSA, National Cybersecurity Alliance, and the NIST National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence have joined forces to bring you this event to help make sense of Zero Trust, whether you are in the public or private sector. In our first panel session, you'll hear from the architects and creators of the leading reference architectures and resources available to you on the path to Zero Trust, including the NIST SP 800-207's Zero Trust Reference Architecture, the Department of Defense Zero Trust Reference Architecture, and the path to Zero Trust starts with identity. In our second panel session, you'll hear from Adobe and Cisco, and government agencies, Department of Homeland Security and Department of Education, who are all well down the path of implementing Zero Trust strategies. They'll share the challenges and lessons learned during their journey. We have a great set of topics to discuss, but we want to make this an interactive session. So if you have questions, please submit them through the comments. Before I hand it over to our first panel, a quick mention of the IDSA. The IDSA is a nonprofit that provides vendor-neutral education and resources to help organizations reduce the risk of a breach by combining identity and security strategies. Our membership consists of leading identity and security vendors, in addition to our customer advisory board, who provide guidance on our mission and represent the practitioner community. So now, let's get started. I want to introduce you to our moderator today, Jerry Chapman. Jerry, how's it going?
Good, Julie. How you doing? Great to see you.
Yeah, great to have you here. Jerry, if I can find my notes here. Jerry is an engineering fellow in identity and access management for Optiv. He is a member of the IDSA Zero Trust Technical Working Group Subcommittee and co-author of Zero Trust Security, an Enterprise Guide. So with that, Jerry, I'm going to bring in all of your panelists and I'm going to let you run with this first session.
Excellent. While you're doing that, just thank you for being here. It's we have an honored group of panelists here, I would say, all with a very good perspective on Zero Trust. What I want to start with is just having each panelist introduce themselves, and then we'll get into some high-level discussion. I'll start with just some basic cybersecurity teams, what mainly the private sector is talking about when it comes to Zero Trust, and then we'll get into very specific questions across the organization. Alper, if you'd like to introduce yourself first.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jerry. Pleasure to be here. My name is Alper Karaman. I joined NIST NCCOE about a few years ago, actually, which coincides with the time that we started our first Zero Trust efforts and at NIST and NCCOE. I'm a cybersecurity professional and project manager and responsible for leading and managing various collaborative projects with industry organizations and government agencies and academia. I currently serve as the technical lead and point of contact for Zero Trust demonstration project at the NCCOE.
Awesome. Thank you, Alper. I appreciate that. Brandon, if you'd like to go next.
Yes, thank you, Jerry, and thank you again for the invite to present here today. So I'm Brandon Niski. I'm the chief engineer for our security enablers portfolio. And so it's kind of a mouthful, but it basically includes our public key or PKI infrastructure, identity and credential access management or ICAM initiatives, as well as our zero trust reference architecture. So I've been with DISA for about 10 years now, and I'm excited to be here to talk about the initiatives we're doing across the Department of Defense.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Stefan, if you'd like to go.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me, Jerry. I'm Stefan Saro, one of the solution architects. I work in the Atos Digital Security Division, dealing with clients. Joined Atos about 2 years ago, leading the Zero Trust Working Group, as well in the part of IDSA's initiatives. And prior to that, I've been working for one of the vendors, been involved in the IAM space for a number of years, and pleasure to be here and talk about Zero Trust. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Stefan. Scott, if you'd like to follow it up.
Sure. Thank you, Jerry. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. My name is Scott Rose. I'm a computer scientist at NIST. I'm one of the primary authors of the NIST special publication 800-207, Zero Trust Architecture, as well as serving as a project member on the NCCOE demonstration project that Alper just described.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. And I'm sure a lot of us have read your documentation around 800-207 documentation is fantastic. I know I spent a lot of time on it, working on it with my co-author doing the Zero Trust Security Enterprise Guide. So thank you for joining. So to kick this off, I just wanted to start with just really talking first about conversations from a client perspective. I have a lot of conversations with clients, and we talk a lot about Zero Trust. And we really spend time just determining, defining what is Zero Trust and what are organizations doing around Zero Trust. It's quite exciting to see the move, unfortunately, through the times over the last 18 months with Zero Trust really coming to the forefront because of the global pandemic and the situations we've been in. But cybersecurity teams are 100% really latching onto the concept of Zero Trust, and they're really starting to just understand how do we go from this principle of what is Zero Trust to how do we deploy Zero Trust. And this is a real concept. I mean, this is certainly something that's really being driven. I want to ask anyone on the panelist, any panelist, first person to chime in. A really hot topic outside of just from our client perspective that's been happening with the conversation is define Zero Trust. What is it? Is it a product? Is it just an architecture? Let's start there. Anyone can chime in first.
It's funny that you mentioned that, Scott, Jerry. Scott mentioned NIST wrote the 800-207 standard for Zero Trust, right? It all started on the networking side of it. And then everyone started thinking, oh yeah, it's great, we'll do the networking part. But it's more than that. And actually the version, even the initial version, right? It focuses on the multiple aspects of security, not just the network. And that's one of the outcomes that came out, part of the feedback and the review process. It's not just about networks or about devices or about individuals. It's just redefining the security boundaries, quote unquote, because the boundaries are pretty much melted and they disappeared. It's not the enterprise, it's everywhere. The individuals carry the devices with them, connect to everywhere. And that's what it's not a product, it's just a concept and philosophy. And people have to be aware that they have multiple building blocks. It's like a puzzle, if you will, right? So you can put the pieces together. Everyone has some piece of the puzzle, maybe not the whole picture, but it's just a roadmap to it and trying to get there to the perfect state or the more secure state and minimize the risk. That's the ideal. Awesome. I think that's what Zero Trust does. Okay.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Stefan. I absolutely agree. And one of the things that I talk about quite frequently and with our customers is, or our clients is it's not just about the network, it's application, it's data. A popular conversation I say is it goes from layer 3 all the way to layer 8, right? That includes the people, if you want to. The user, absolutely. That has to be a part of the conversation. So, and another question. So I'm gonna take this to Scott. I think, or anyone can answer, but it's just an additional conversation around, zero trust versus SASE. I don't know. Do you have an opinion about that, Scott?
Not a really strong one. Basically, they're not 100% compatible. There's a bunch of overlap. SASE could be an approach to zero trust. You could do it in a zero trust way. It's a tool or technology that you could use, but it's not necessarily like if you're not using it, you're not doing zero trust. That's not true. I mean, there is a lot of misconceptions that zero trust requires the cloud or requires single sign-on. Not always. I mean, it's like I said, it's a set of principles and a strategy. It's not really a single technology or a single approach to how you design your enterprise.
Absolutely. And a popular way I like to describe it, and anyone can jump in on this, is we've created a Venn diagram of SASE and zero trust. And if you think about SASE and you think about zero trust, we kind of put ZTNA, so zero trust networking and zero trust networking, in the middle of those two, as well as identity. Those two really seem to be the intersecting point around SASE and zero trust, and we spend a lot of time about that. I just wondered, Brandon or Alper, do you have anything you want to add to that, or
No, I would agree with what's said already. I mean, I think as we look at SASE and how we can improve how we do remote access, I mean, I think it's a critical piece on the network pillar of zero trust, but again, it's not the end all be all from our perspective. As you mentioned, we also agree identity is a foundational piece. We have a lot of initiatives in that arena to strengthen how we do that and modernize it. Because frankly, in the department, we've been so heavily focused on PKI, we haven't looked at a lot of the modern auth pieces and establish those foundational enterprise services that we really need. And so those are additional priorities that we were already underway on really before zero trust kind of started to catch steam. So we very closely have those aligned. And again, that's why, at least from my perspective, I'm excited that we have both of those in our portfolio together to really further foot stomp the relationship there.
Fantastic.
And the processing happens at the edge these days, right? So a lot of that, but there's the misconception, if you will, that if it's happening at the edge, it's not going through the enterprise to the regular networks and everything. They got away, right? It's still cleared through some mainframe in the backend on the banks where the credit card transactions are happening. So it looks simple, it looks at the edge, but it's really involving a lot of the other components. So it's Scott rightly mentioned, right? It's a subset of the actual zero trust overall. And that's one thing to keep in mind.
Excellent. So Scott, I'm gonna come to you because I think the 800-207 documentation has really become a staple. It's a lot of organizations are referencing it, and through that there's a lot of there's questions, and we're gonna dive into some of that. But let's start with a very specific question. If you could start by describing, in your words, so everyone can hear it outside of just the document, describe the 800-207 architecture, how it was developed, who and what did you use to get inputs to drive that? I mean, it definitely was a collaboration, but what was that? I'll stop there and then I'll ask a couple more questions as we dig further. Does that make sense, Scott?
Yeah. Well, think of it not really as a reference architecture, I mean, or a standard, because it's not really that. There's not a whole lot of that kind of language in there. We meant it to be kind of a conceptual framework sort of document. NIST has kind of a similar document that years ago was published. It was a 500 series on cloud computing, kind of defining, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, kind of like, this is what you should think about when you hear those terms, and this is how you should use those terms, those kind of documents. And that's kind of our inspiration for it, because we saw a lot of confusion. I mean, everybody wanted zero trust and they didn't know what it was. When I talk to one vendor, he calls zero trust A, but then when I talk to another vendor, they call it B. What is zero trust, that sort of thing. So we kind of, with the co-authors, and then actually with an interagency group of, a lot of other members from different kind of agencies throughout the federal government, we kind of looked at some of the vendor products, and we had vendors come in and give their presentations, kind of like saying, like, this is how they view zero trust. And we'd ask them, like, what do you think is missing? How do you find it? That sort of thing. and we came down to these kind of the approaches we had, where we kind of developed these kind of set of principles, and then we had the abstract architecture where we're kind of laying out the functional components. Now those aren't, they're all boxes with words in them, but they don't necessarily mean like that is a individual one system that performs that one action. It could be different. It could be multiple systems doing that function, or one system doing multiple functions. Whatever is meant to be abstract. It's meant to be used by both planners, architects, implementers and deployers, operators, admins, even procurement, to say, when you say zero trust, when you say a policy engine, when you say a policy enforcement point, what do you mean? When you say you want to do, you're looking for something that can do an agent gateway kind of model, what do you mean when you say that, sort of thing? And this is to kind of help people kind of have a common reference or a common set of terms and ideas to do that. It's not perfect. It's our first attempt. So, it may come into further refinement as we move on and through the ages, but, this is kind of like the initial kind of idea we're putting forward as kind of a conceptual framework sort of thing.
No, that's perfect. And there's a lot of conversation around. You mentioned the concepts, and you mentioned a lot of that. There's a lot of conversation around the policy decision points and the policy enforcement points, and I know that's a common conversation that I have with my clients, especially as we reference the 800-207 documentation. You mentioned some core principles. Do you want to highlight one or two of those core principles that really just drive home what we should be looking at in the cybersecurity space, as this is some stuff we need to drive for with Zero Trust?
There's 7 of them, so I'm not going to list all of them because
no.
obviously.
Yep.
And actually, if you go on and you do your own reading and you do your own, kind of looking at some of the other documents that are out there, I think the UK has one. There's another couple out there, Forrester maybe. They all kind of say the same thing, just in different terms. You can almost do a mapping one-to-one. But some of the ones I know, at least that we kind of highlight as we're kind of different than others, if anything, just to call out, because we think that's important, is one, everything should be considered a resource. Most of the time the document uses resource in kind of a server sense, in a client-server interaction. But it's basically a resource. Everything is a resource, not just your data center, your databases, things like that, but you also got your compute nodes, you've got your network infrastructure, you've got sensors and actuators maybe. All those should be considered a resource. And the other one is that while Zero Trust encompasses a lot of monitoring, and monitoring is essential because you need to react to changing network conditions and environmental conditions or newly discovered information, there's going to be cases where you can't do that. There are entire protocols being designed with the idea of third-party monitoring is an attack, and we need to mitigate that. So we're taking that kind of a more lax view of that than some of the other principles of saying, your stuff you should obviously monitor. It's yours. You own it. But take that into account that there may be traffic on your network that you can't monitor. You can't do deep packet inspection. You can do other kind of monitoring. You can maybe do some other metadata analysis or whatever. But you can't just assume that you can inspect every packet on your network and react accordingly. You may be classifying that kind of traffic differently, and that's kind of two of the main differences in our set of principles from some of the other stuff. Some of the other ones are going out there, but otherwise they're all the same.
Yeah, I quite frankly a lot of times say we just do an amalgamation of all the principles and figure out how do we make them, something that we can strategically and tactically deploy. It just makes a lot of sense. So with the NIST 800-207 documentation in mind, and Brandon, I'm gonna come over to you and see how is the DISA and the DoD, how do you see the implementation of some of the concepts that's in the 800-207 documentation, and more importantly, I think as a big question, how do you see like a PDP being deployed, the policy decision point being a core part of a Zero Trust architecture and making that a reality?
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. And maybe if you don't mind, I'll start kind of covering what the Zero Trust reference architecture is from a DoD perspective.
Absolutely.
So from our vantage point, it was an engagement with NIST as well as with academia, other research institutions, and industry to really kind of do a lot of the similar things of what Scott already said, but making sure that we're putting it in the context of how DoD defines things, especially with our standards around how we look at reference architectures, as well as DODAF and some of the ways we generally document architectures. So we thought it was critical at least to get the department on the same page of adopting some of those same industry standards, but kind of also in our world. So that was what we worked on effectively last year, wrapped that up by the end of last calendar year, and now it's available on the DoD CIO's library site if you search for that. So from my vantage point, again, I think identity is a critical enabler to zero trust. So again, another part of our portfolio is our ICAM initiative, which is all about modern authentication, identity governance, and how we can correlate identities and bring together these siloed identity sources together to truly have common visibility and audit capabilities. Additionally, my organization is also looking at efforts that we call under Thunderdome. So it's looking at SASE-like capabilities. It's also looking at how we can, I like to say modernize the perimeter, but at the same time, we know the perimeter is completely changed. So it's how do we modernize that at multiple tiers within the network, and then also looking at how we can better leverage software-defined networking and other capabilities, and all of that really comes into play. And so that's why we've kind of put those all together in one set of requirements that modernize and align to zero trust principles. It's not trying to cover every single part of zero trust, but it hits a big swath of those requirements. So again, from the question around the policy decision point, again, from my vantage point, I think there's many within the architecture. And the fundamental from my vantage point is, as we can modernize how we do authentication, we can bring together additional telemetry and make more conditional access decisions, more so than just I have a strong, potentially cryptographic authenticator, or maybe I'm on a personal device and I have lesser assurance with that, but I still need to be able to do my job. We need to enable these kind of functionalities and capabilities for our end users while having this kind of granular security and bring in this additional telemetry and capabilities that the industry is bringing to us, kind of in alignment with zero trust. So I mean, that's kind of the way I look at it from our lens, and that's really what I see as kind of the way we're moving forward in alignment with zero trust principles.
Awesome. So Brandon, I'm gonna ask you a question that I think just came in. I think it aligns with what you were just, you were talking about, bringing that perimeter down, and it's the perimeter at the resource. That's a very common conversation. So the question from I think coming out of the community is, does zero trust mandate authentication to every resource? So I think that's almost a how does. But it could be a just does it. So I'm going to leave that question. If you want to answer it, then anyone else on the panel may want to chime in to start with.
I mean, I think that's kind of the principle, is we're trying to not always trust, but verify. So we want it to do that to the greatest extent possible, whether that's establishing network segments or users accessing application resources. Obviously, there's exceptions where you want to have guest or anonymous users for collaboration purposes. That's probably the number one area where there's probably an exception to that. But in most other cases, yes, we want to have strong authentication. We want to understand the end user, the device that it's coming from, the network it's on, potentially location. All these things come together to better define the security and risk of that particular user or data or session.
That's perfect, and I think that's quite reality, right? Bring the authentication down to the team or to the resource. So got another question coming for you, Brandon, and I just want to just kind of keep it flowing as much as possible. What does the makeup of the mission team supporting DISA ZTA look like, and what are some of the professional credentials that team has?
Yeah, great question. So our initiative has been a cross government and cross DoD initiative. So while we've led the DoD reference architecture development, we also do that in conjunction with our peers at NSA, as well as US Cyber Command and DoD CIO. So we have a collective team of resources from various backgrounds, both in professional IT, as well as project management, coming together to build those capabilities, as well as engage with other parts of the department that have to operationally achieve these type of missions or architectures. So some of our collective team does engage with those pilot participants that are looking at some of these bleeding edge capabilities and how they're adopted, and trying to develop or at least capture lessons learned to be able to share and update our reference architecture for the larger group as kind of a center of excellence.
Awesome. No, that's great information. I appreciate that. So Stefan, I'm gonna come over to you. So the IDSA is a global identity-defined security alliance. It's all about identity, putting identity in the middle of security. I mean, I started working with the group about 5-6 years ago when it really branched out. So I want to put something from you, because I think you lead the Zero Trust subcommittee. So IDSA is viewing cybersecurity through an identity-centric lens. How do you see identity solutions fitting into the architecture of a policy decision point?
So if you look, for example, that's a very good question. And if you look historically from an evolution standpoint, as Scott mentioned, there are some guidelines, some things that were actually inserted the standard, but policy decision points have been there for decades at this point. Like, you had a lot of web access management solutions. And again, from the never, always verify standpoint, if you look way back on the web access management side of it, session management was a critical thing, because you would have been authenticated, but the authorization part of it, your access to something as an individual, would have perpetuated if the authorization would continue, right? So cutting off someone whose access from an authentication standpoint was disabled was critical. So with IDSA looks at all that's encompassing security from an identity standpoint, and identity could be connected to the network part of it, but could be also a machine, for example, machine ID service accounts. And that's where some of the compute aspects of it, parts that you may not have controls to, are very important, because you will notice that, for example, there's traffic on the network, but there's activity that you may not be aware. Think cloud, all the automation on the clouds, the elastic scalability, all those are automated processes. If something is not watched there and someone starts building machines and identities are not controlled there, they would cause, they'll be problematic. So those are things that will also tie into the Zero Trust architectures NIST for the policy decision point. So regardless of what the identity is, human or non-human, non-person entity as NIST defines it, you'll have to control those and make sure you authenticate, but you also authorize, and real-time you cut off the authorization if that's no longer applicable. And be granular.
No, that's a great answer, and I think that's fantastic. And if I can just add a little bit, I think I spend a lot of time talking about this topic, and one of the things I do talk about is identity governance solutions really coming in and playing a part in the PDP, right? Because if I put identity in the middle of security, and if I'm putting identity as centric to a Zero Trust architecture, what type of solution should have visibility into all identities across the organization. And if you think about that, that's really going to be an identity governance or an identity administration tool that's going to have that visibility, or potentially have that visibility, and then be able to initiate policy across the organization as it pertains to those identities. So it's certainly something I spend some time talking about. So I think that's fantastic.
Right. Yeah. And even in non-IT space, right? The operational technology, anything that has telemetry on an operating system, it will function, and you'd have to apply controls to make sure things are actually according to a policy that you define, not basically granting access unauthorized to whatever. So least privilege will apply everywhere.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Alper, I'm gonna come over to you and ask you an interesting question around. Can you describe some of the NCCOE's collaboration projects, and how can it benefit the public and private sector?
Yeah, sure. I hope you can hear me.
Yep.
I
can hear you.
My earphone, but that's good. So I'll start with a little bit of a background about my organization. The National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, the NCCOE, falls under one of the labs at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, right, NIST. More specifically, it falls under a NIST's Information Technology Lab. And so NCCOE is a component of NIST. And it is referred to as a collaborative hub because we are able to work together with industry organizations, government agencies, and academia alike. And we do this over collaborative projects, which we build example solutions for pressing cybersecurity issues. So it's a public-private partnership in a sense, where we work with entities through consortia under CRADAS. We use commercially available technologies to develop modular and easily adaptable example solutions. And also, we complement each solution with a NIST 1800 series document, which we call it a practice guide, in which we outline the details of how we put together the solution, the steps for another entity to recreate the example solution, list of technologies used, test scenarios conducted, and of course, we also map the solution capabilities to the NIST cybersecurity framework. And the NCCOE was established back in 2012 by NIST. So since then, we've been running many cybersecurity projects and providing public and private sector with easily adaptable example solutions, along with practice guides that outline how to build them.
Okay, and so can you elaborate on any of those any of the demo projects that you may be doing? Some of the I think the DIU, ACT, IAC, any of those types of projects that are out there going on right now.
The projects that I'm working on, I'm not familiar with all the projects that we've ran since 2012 because I joined 3 years ago.
Okay.
But so I am responsible for. I lead the Zero Trust demonstration project. I can talk about that. There's also the enterprise project, which has to do with cybersecurity hygiene. So it's about building a system and approach to improve enterprises' patching practices, which is an ongoing project, and it's been for about a year. And so that's one project that we're in fact thinking about combining it with the system that we build in that project, combining it with the Zero Trust project that I'm also leading. The Zero Trust project is it's important to mention that it's actually a follow-on project to the ZTA guidance that we published, specifically the NIST SP 800-207. We officially announced the project back in October of 2020 with the publishing of the Federal Register notice, which is typically how we announce the projects. It's an official call out for industry participation. We put out a project description at our website. We outlined a project objective and requirements for the project. Since then, we received over 67 industry requests to participate on the project. So it was a challenging task to actually meet with each vendor based on first come, first serve to assess their technology capabilities with respect to the project security and solution requirements. So we went through thorough technology capabilities and analysis, and obviously we, based on that, we selected 18 initial vendors that met our project's requirements. And then we launched the project officially on July 21st, 2021, which is about 2 weeks ago. So we're no longer accepting letters of interest to participate on the project, obviously, as that window closed back in January of this year. That said, as we go deeper into project's design and build phases, it's possible that we might discover and need other security requirements along the way, and that we have not anticipated beforehand. And so we're keeping track of every vendor that is still reaching out to us, so that if and when the opportunities to join the project become available, we will reach out and let them know in order to bring on those capabilities to satisfy those newfound requirements. As for implementation, our initial goal is to implement multiple builds based on the 3 ZTA approaches that we describe in our 800-207 guidance. They are, we guys already been making reference to those, and of course, one will be based on enhanced identity governance approach, right? An important one. Another one will be based on microsegmentation, and also, of course, based on SDP, software-defined perimeter approach. And of course, we might have additional builds that might be hybrids of these approaches that I've mentioned, right? Because there's just so many ways to really build on ZTA. But of course, it will all depend on what we decide collaboratively with the participants on the project, based on what would bring value to public and private sector in terms of specific builds. So that is our goal. So it's a new project that we launch, and obviously we haven't started any kind of integrations yet. Though we have built a network infrastructure. That's a good something to mention here. It's a network infrastructure actually that mimics the use case that we describe in 800-207 guidance, which is the one that we refer to as the enterprise with satellite facilities use case. And so the network infrastructure that we built houses 3 enterprises that are independent, each with own shared services, a branch office, a coffee shop. At the moment, we're missing a cloud environment, and which is essential in terms of having a complete hybrid environment, right, for the project. But we will be acquiring that shortly as well, so to make it complete. Our goal is to use this infrastructure as a brownfield, if you will, and implement ZTAs over it, and then demonstrate various types of user access to resources that will be sprinkled across this hybrid environment that we built in the lab. And then, of course, we'll demonstrate employee, contractor, guest access to these resources from anywhere, which obviously includes the remote workers and teleworker scenarios, right? We want to cover those. And, of course, maybe one thing to mention here is about the challenges. One thing that we anticipate will be obviously in terms of integration. As not all vendor products will integrate with each other. and not all vendor, some will but some will integrate, right? Some will integrate through plugins, APIs, or through some other means. So we have to determine all of those, and then come up with builds with technologies that can, work together for orchestration of ZTAs. So in the end, our goal is to, collect lessons learned from the builds and scenarios and document them in our practice guide. And of course, they will also help us in identifying gaps, which is important to mention, and areas that may require further research in Zero Trust. So I think that's all we have so far to share, about the project. And again, we just launched, but I hope that I was able to provide some valuable insight to our efforts.
Yeah, let me, I've done this with everyone else. Let me dive into one specific thing, because you called out 2 things that is really, really interesting to me. A lot of things interesting, but I think they're pertinent to the direction I've taken this conversation a little bit. You mentioned you modularizing components, working on integration of technology, and then you talked about the enhanced ID architecture or process or way that you to implement or go around to do zero trust or ZTA. If I were to, what advances or have you done anything around integrating identity or enhanced identity with policy decision points, or creating almost a single dashboard of what a policy decision point should look like within the NCCOE?
Yeah, so right after we released our guidance, ZTA guidance, the 800-207, we actually ran an internal project to build a NCCOE or a ZTA Test Lab at the NCCOE. So this infrastructure that I mentioned, we built it then, but we of course enhanced it for this project that we just launched. So I will refer to it as the first phase. In the first phase of that effort, we acquired some zero trust technologies and played around, essentially integrated them, developed test cases and tested some aspects of zero trust. So we had some hands-on experience from the perspective of policy engine, policy administrator, policy enforcement points, and so, but we wanted to obviously take it a step further and provide a follow-on project to the guidance that we provided with ZTA, and so we've launched this bigger project with quite a few vendor participants. So yes, we have some, to answer that short, we have some experience building that, but the vendors, participating vendors that we selected for the project, obviously have been doing this for many years, right? And our goal is to leverage that expertise, their experience, their technology capabilities, and also apply our guidance that we provide on ZTA with the 800-207 and build these or implement these builds that will bring value to private sector and public sector.
That's fantastic, and that leads into one of the questions we're getting from the community is do you and this I'll pair Brandon, Scott, even Stefan, anyone want to answer this or add some value to this? Are there any plans to include lessons learned for non-vendor organizations? Right, not for the vendors, but for an organization that's on the zero trust journey. And are there any plans for that?
Definitely, there are. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, as I mentioned earlier, it's part of any NCCOE project to collect that information and describe it, in detail in our practice guide. So we will definitely be doing that. That's all I wanted to say. Sorry about that, Stefan.
No, and that's actually a very valid point, because from a consulting perspective or system integrators perspective, it's just not the vendor side of it. It's also trying to get the landscape, how each client implements various use cases, and essentially developer's point, document those things and see the variations, and whatever lessons learned we have or interop, include those. And if you look, the best example, if you will, it's the melding or the boundary between the IT and the OT in the automation space with non-person entities. As Alper mentioned, right, with all the APIs and microsegmentation, microservices, the lessons learned everywhere in terms of how people do microservices. And anyway, it's just not the buzzword, it's how you secure those processes, how you secure when you have limited capabilities on any industrial device or something that does have an authentication authorization and the company shall not be named could be hacked. And then you take over the control of all the distribution for things on that particular network just because you ignored ENB, right, the non-person entity side of it. So things we always strive to include, especially on the IDSA as well, as Julie mentioned. It's a vendor-neutral organization. It's essentially community-based, and we're gathering feedback from NIST, NCCOE, and vendors alike to try to gather all that information, knowledge, and put it into practical guidelines.
Awesome. Brandon?
And from a DoD perspective, so we do staff our reference architecture through existing engineering review boards for the feedback across the entire department. So we got near 600 comments that we adjudicated for the initial 1.0 architecture, and we're planning a release of a 2.0 update later this year. So we do have opportunities for feedback that we take into consideration as well within our process within the DoD as well.
Awesome. Scott, did you want to add anything there? Give you an opportunity. You can say no, it's okay.
No, I mean, I think it was, pretty much Alper covered it all. Yeah, I mean, we're, from what, experience for working with the NCCOE, it's not, they're not going to be a black box. I think we are going to try to reach out and provide information as the project goes on, as we can, as to provide this kind of view. So it's not something like, sit back and wait for, X months until we're done and then bump, it all just drops on you. We're going to try and get, community involvement as much as we can, or at least provide some sort of those kind of lessons learned early to get some early feedback, and at least, get people insight of what's going on at the NCCOE that they can use right then and there, and they don't have to wait.
And one of the things, if you look at, from example, frameworks perspective, aside of the NIST standard and some of the approaches, on the ADSA side, for example, there's a huge focus on the compute side of it. So you cannot ignore that component. It's just something that happens, and most of the times it's something that you don't monitor or have a lot of insight into. So from IDSA's perspective, that's something we, from working with the vendors, we do strive to get the information and make them aware of it. At least if you look at bigger vendors, some of them say, yeah, no, it's just the device, the data, and anything in between. But compute, it's a black box. To Alper's point, you shouldn't be a black box. You should have visibility. You should be able to control and apply zero trust where possible in flight.
Absolutely. So I'm gonna ask another question that's come in. So I'm going to ask a few questions that I think is coming in from the guests, and it's a question that it's a conversation I have a lot around, and I'm just going to really just going to sum this up in a little a single question. What is the state of the art for managing identities for NPEs, right? Because NPE is a big conversation for in a zero trust world, right? So if you have PKI or something along these lines, Brandon, this might be right along your lane, your aisle, but really creating security and ensuring authentication and providing identity in an NPE environment. What is your take on that one?
So we do have enterprise capabilities for certificate issuance for NPEs. So that is a capability that the department has, or the Department of Defense has, both on unclassified and secret fabrics. So that does exist. There are some new emerging areas more around robotic process automation and other automation capabilities where that line gets a little blurrier than it's traditionally been, where you kind of have to, in some cases, either act on behalf of a user or have the machine identity look very similar to a user persona for certain systems to work. Because again, we kind of have this in an organization as big as the Department of Defense. We have a lot of applications that are in some cases designed against a standard, and then others that we kind of have to work with to bring into compliance with how we do identity. In some cases, you have to have a very flexible process in how you support some of those automation efforts, and how you either have to represent an end user or a human entity or a person entity versus a non-person or machine identity. So those are other emerging areas that we're looking at as well too. And again, as we look at some of the modern auth capabilities, those can also come into play where maybe certificates don't always make sense across the board.
Awesome. Stefan, did you want to add to that?
And if you look at it from that perspective, essentially the trend is like now with zero trust and all the advent of security and the attention that's paid to the actual access and authorization to resources for anyone, regardless of type of identity. It's also the fact that these days you are essentially trying to build security in. It's something that before might have not been as in focus as it is now, but these days most of the products are built from the ground up with security. And to Brandon's point, any tools out there will have security items in them. So it's not you're going to have some application running with scripts built into it and have authorization, credentials, authentication authorization into the application. You'll try to externalize. If you look at CI/CD, continuous improvement, continuous development, right? There are tools that are actually doing this. You check out, check in application accounts, and you track those. So all these tools do exist. Vendors try to pretty much address all the use cases and cover as much as it can as we uncover new use cases.
No, absolutely. No, great stuff. Let me ask the question I'm sure everyone on this call has heard. I can tell you I've heard it a million times, but I think it's a great question because everyone wants to know this. Where do we start? You know, with organizations, you know, every organization, they have technologies up and down the spectrum across the entire zero trust architecture space, and we all talk about it. So, you know, I want to give each of you a minute to say, where do we start? So, Alper, if you want to start, where do we start with a zero trust journey?
Yeah, we get this question a lot too. So my general response to that is start with your understanding your current environment. Figuring out where everything is, your business process, of course, the workflows from that perspective, your user base, especially from network perspective, obviously where your device is, you want to have complete visibility, right? So evaluation of that is number one step, I would say, in terms of planning for the planning stage. So that's really the starting point, and out of that you will discover that some of the components that you might actually the educational aspect of is really important too. So understand what zero trust, what zero trust is, what zero trust architecture is, what new components that it introduces, how they work. From the perspective of policies, enforcing policies, from the perspective of even in the back end, analysis of the logs for all the requests, the traffic within your network, how to handle those. Some aspect of those obviously in place in certain environments, and some people are already using some supporting components for zero trust architectures, and they may not even realize. So the education surrounding that whole concept of moving toward ZTA is
so important. I want to cut you off. I want to see if no, great answer. I think it's fantastic. Brandon, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I would just reference the maturity model. I think at least our reference architecture has, and I think several other commercial and NIST documents probably have as well. But again, it really looks at discovery, assessment, and then baseline, and then it mature from there. So from my perspective, again, it shouldn't be a one size fits all as we apply this. Again, at the end of the day, it's a cybersecurity strategy. So we've got to move more towards the right fit for the right priority of the component within the architecture.
Perfect.
So I would summarize it from that perspective.
Awesome. Scott, as the lead author of the NIST 800-207 document, I'd love to hear your thought on that.
Alper already said it. You need to have that kind of knowledge before you can set policies for authorization and authentication. You need to know, the network identities and the devices and the data flows and everything. But then on top of that, once you do know that, usually recommend then going to identifying what the high value assets are. What are the most important resources in the organization that are critical to the mission, and then those are the ones you really want to make sure you get right. So you want to develop the policies around those. So that's usually at least where you start. Like, what are your most important resources that you need?
100%. I call those crown jewels. Stefan?
Yeah. So basically, to what everyone said, they described it pretty well. But you don't start from zero. So the good part about zero trust journey is like pretty much no one starts from zero. You have the foundation in place. You have to have the foundation in place. There's no way around it. The identities, you have to understand what's in the enterprise. But at the same time, focus on what's the priority. As Scott had just mentioned, right? Prioritize your investments. Make sure that you are looking at the high value assets. You don't have to protect the gates if you have enough security at the gates. So protect the other parts. Things you have to think about in terms of what you're doing and where you're at, map, and start from there, see where the gaps are, and prioritize accordingly.
Perfect. So with a minute left for this panel, I just want to say, ask real quick, where can participants or guests go to find information about what you're doing as an organization and just get some of this information? Alper, I'll let you start first.
Yes, specifically for our project, the ZTA demonstration project, our website is a very good resource. All you have to do is just, right off of the landing page, click on projects and find Zero Trust project. And on that page, everything is outlined.
Awesome. Thank you. Brandon?
Yep, for our Zero Trust reference architecture, if you just search for the DoD CIO library, you'll find a collection of information there regarding ICAM as well as Zero Trust, and the Zero Trust reference architecture is fully available out there on class, no restrictions.
Excellent. Scott?
Same, yeah. The NCCOE webpage is probably the best. There also is a email community of interest there where we'll be sending out announcements.
Excellent. And Stefan?
Yes, and from the IDSA's perspective, essentially you have the resource on the IDSA's website, IDSA Alliance, and there are Zero Trust specific items, and also the white paper that provides some guidance in terms of where you can start, what can be done, and we're planning to publish a roadmap about it. So,
awesome.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, with that, thank you very much. Thank you, gentlemen, for your participation. A lot of good information shared here. With that, now I'm going to turn it over to Eileen Division from the NCCOE.
Hi, thank you, Jerry. Can everybody hear me okay? I'll take that as a yes. I'm Eileen Division. I'm an outreach and communication strategist with the NIST National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, or the NCCOE. And I support their Zero Trust Architectures project and research. So while we're bringing the next set of panelists on, I want to take this opportunity to first thank all of you for joining us today. I want to give a special thank you to the IDSA and the NCSA for helping us co-host this event. And I hope you're all enjoying the discussion so far. I'm taking a look at the comments right now. It seems to be a really robust discussion on LinkedIn, and for that, we're grateful. So when we began our work in Zero Trust at the NCCOE, it was back in 2018. Our first meetup had about 30 people in attendance. It was a pretty small affair. The next year, we hosted a workshop of about 200 people. And then fast forward to 2021 and add in a global pandemic and an executive order that mentions Zero Trust, and we now have over 2,000 people at this event. So to me, it's pretty exciting to see the uptick in organizations looking to implement the security principles of Zero Trust. If you're not familiar with the NCCOE and what we do, or if you're just joining us and you missed some of Alper's explanation, the NCCOE, we're part of the Applied Cybersecurity Division at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. So what makes us unique at the NCCOE, I believe, is the hands-on nature of our work. So we help businesses, large and small, manage their cyber risks by showing them how to use commercial off-the-shelf technologies and products to improve their ability to prevent, detect, and respond to cyber threats and vulnerabilities. And over the past decade in our labs, we've configured more than 330 commercially available technologies into targeted, standards-based cybersecurity solutions to help protect banks, hospitals, utilities, hotels, government, and small businesses and the people they serve. As mentioned earlier, all of our example solutions are documented and they're freely available as NIST cybersecurity practice guides. They include information and instructions so that you or people in your organizations can easily replicate some or all of the example solution. The guides are designed to help you gain efficiencies in implementing cyber technologies while also saving you research and proof of concept costs. But underpinning all of our work and publications, though, is collaboration. And collaboration isn't just a buzzword at the NCCOE, it's really the heart and soul of what we do. So we collaborate with industry to understand their cyber challenges. We assemble teams of industry organizations and government agencies and academic institutions to address all aspects of that challenge. And then we join with technology vendors to help build practical solutions to address the challenge. And finally, as mentioned earlier, we invite you, the public, to comment, to provide us feedback, and to help us develop the best possible and the most useful tools and guidance. And so it's in that spirit of collaboration that I want to share that NIST released a new draft cybersecurity white paper entitled Planning for a Zero Trust Architecture, a Starting Guide for Administrators, which provides a high-level overview of NIST's risk management framework and how it can help in developing and implementing a zero trust architecture. So the public comment period for that is open now through September 3rd. I'll be sure to drop a link to the document in the LinkedIn chat during the next session, though I think I saw a few of you had already dropped it in. Thank you. We want your feedback. We're also preparing to pilot something that we're calling the Zero Trust Architecture Forum, which will be an informal email discussion group for those of you who are engaged in planning, designing, building, and managing zero trust architectures. So you can share your lessons learned, you can find answers, or just make some connections. We'll use the forum at the NCCOE to share updates on our zero trust projects, our people, our events. And we'll engage with this group to refine NIST guidance on zero trust. And we'll solicit feedback on our projects too. So we have a few just administrative hurdles to clear, but we hope to launch the forum very soon. The best way to learn about the ZTA forum launch is to sign up to the NCCOE mailing list by going to our website and clicking the sign up for newsletter button in the upper right-hand corner of the page. Or you can follow us on Twitter. We're at NIST Cyber. Our website information and Twitter handle are on the slide shown here. At this time, I want to turn over the virtual floor to Lisa Plegemeyer. Lisa is the Interim Executive Director of the National Cybersecurity Alliance, and she'll be moderating our second panel discussion. I want to thank you again for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of the event. And Lisa, over to you.
Thanks, Eileen. So first I'm going to do a little public service announcement here about the NCSA. Do we have the slides? Eileen, are the slides showing up for everybody? I don't think so. I just see myself on the slides. Here we go. If we can go over to the first slide. If you have all three, I'll just start talking. We'll just start. So first, a little bit about us. The National Cybersecurity Alliance. In short, we empower a more secure, connected world. We bring together and are supported by public and private partners, DHS, CISA, other federal partners, major corporations, small businesses, and other nonprofits to encourage the safe and secure use of all technology. We educate on best practices and amplify collective efforts to affect behavior change. We do this through National Cybersecurity Awareness Month that you see, and I made a mistake. We dropped the national last year. It's now just Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Also Data Privacy Day and other activities during the year. So October is right around the corner. Please go to our website, staysafeonline.org, and sign up to become a champion. It's free. Individuals and organizations can all sign up. And that gives you access to a toolkit, which gives you everything you need to run a Cybersecurity Awareness Month awareness campaign in your organization. You get your name listed on our website, among other benefits. So please visit staysafeonline.org. And now let's get on with the panel. So we have some really esteemed professionals with us today as they're joining here. If our short prep call a week or so ago was any indication, I think this is going to be a really lively discussion. As they're joining, I'm going to let each one of them introduce themselves. So please give us your name, your title, and your organization, and give us a few words on what zero trust means to you. We hear a lot of people talking about it, but I'm not sure we're all on the same page and have clarity and consensus in the security world, much less the technology world. So what does zero trust mean to you? Let's start with Den from Cisco. Would you introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, so Dan Jones, Senior Director of Enterprise Security at Cisco. And in Cisco, we think of Zero Trust in three ways. We think about it for the workforce, the workplace, and the workload. So for the purpose of today's call, we're going to focus on the workforce.
And Eric, how about you?
Hi, my name's Eric Anderson. I'm Director of Enterprise Security at Adobe. For Zero Trust, I agree with Dan. We do look at it from a workforce perspective, and that's what we're going to focus on today. But it's really about, as the title says, that we trust. We don't trust, but we verify.
Brian?
Hey, good afternoon. Brian Campo. I'm the Acting Chief Technology Officer for Department of Homeland Security. And I agree. I mean, I think there's a lot of aspects to Zero Trust. I think one of the biggest ones is just the mindset change, the culture change, and how we approach security, how we think about security. That certainly touches people, processes, technology, all the different aspects. But I think from our perspective, we've been really thinking about how the culture and the mindset changes are going to affect us.
And Stephen.
Afternoon, folks. Stephen Hernandez, Chief Information Security Officer at the U.S. Department of Education. I also co-chair the Federal CISO Council. For us, when we think about Zero Trust, it's really about, in many ways, taking a lot of what we already have and optimizing it and advancing it. Zero Trust can bring forth both incredible user experiences where the user is less engaged necessarily in the security and more focused on their work. It can also bring about tremendous cost savings when we think about how are we optimizing our infrastructure, moving away from legacy concepts like tie caps and into more future thinking designs. So we're very excited about it, and we're very happy to see it called out in the executive order as well.
I love it when better security also means cost savings. I think that's often overlooked. So question number one, we're all familiar with the common saying that cybersecurity can be broken down into three pillars: people, process, technology, as Brian mentioned. When it comes to your organization's Zero Trust implementation, which of the three pillars do you find the most or the least challenging, if you want to be a glass half empty person or a glass half full person? Brian, we're going to start with you because you jumped on the people, process, technology bandwagon in your intro. Is the glass half full or the glass half empty?
I am not sure if you can hear me. I just lost connection.
We can hear you. Your video froze, but we can hear you. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I will go ahead and give you sort of an idea. I think when we look at it, I'll definitely start with the glass half full. I think there are a lot of great opportunities, as some of the other panelists mentioned. For us, we really try to think about it in terms of what are the use cases that Zero Trust can support us with. So, we're looking at processes where Zero Trust is going to be beneficial. Our move to the cloud, our move to, different ways of managing the network, trying to give more security references to programs and processes. So those are really areas where I think we see a lot of opportunity. Some other.
Oops. Now we've lost him. All right, while he's trying to rejoin, and maybe Julie backstage can text him and see what we can do there. Who else would like to weigh in on challenges or accomplishments, least challenging, most challenging, people, process, or technology? Stephen, how about you?
So for us, I mean, we're already underway with several of the big pieces that we're going to need. We've got an established identity, credential, and access management program, which is going to be one of the core pillars. You can't do ZTA without identity and access control. Just can't. And then the other piece that we have that we're pretty proud of is our cyber data lake. So we have a data lake that replaces a traditional SIEM, replaces what we consider like a cyber data warehouse. And really, it's the one source where all data about cybersecurity ends up, whether it's continuous diagnostics and mitigation, our firewalls, whatever the log may be, it ends up in there. And that's a big part of understanding our data and the metadata. Probably some of the most challenging spaces for us are out there in that policy engine, trust engine, especially when we start to look across the enterprise and a multitude of tools and systems, because there we're bringing in artificial intelligence, AML, machine learning type of technologies, and really understanding how those type of capabilities can start to effectuate the control fabric and different systems, different products, different services. And that's a real hard thing to do. And you got to have all these fundamentals in place first before you get there.
Eric, do you want to take a stab at that question? Tell us about life at Adobe.
Sure. Yeah, if we're looking at looking back at people, process, and technology, probably the most challenging is the process piece. I think there's all kinds of technology out there, like Stephen mentioned. Getting IAM in place and having protection on devices and the network. The hard part is having the processes in place or defining those processes, because then you would use the technology to enforce those processes or the policies that you would say. People kind of interweave throughout that whole thing. People don't like change, but I think as we talked about, one of the benefits of Zero Trust, in a lot of ways, it's one of the few times where you can increase security and a lot of times make the user experience better. So leveraging that and getting people on board and understanding, I think, really helps as you start turning on enforcement and defining these policies. And then, just finding the right technology to make sure that you're able to support that.
Increased security and a better user experience. This is another very exciting.
Yeah, it's a very rare situation. So it's fun to take advantage of that.
That and actually cost savings together. Yeah, this is exciting. Brian, why don't we go back to you? I see you're got over your connection issues. Welcome back.
Right. Yes, I appreciate it. Thank you. So yeah, I'm not sure if you guys got to hear much at all, but I was looking at really, the opportunity side of Zero Trust around how we can make meaningful change. And, as Eric was saying, in some of our user-focused activities, really trying to move a lot of the security work out of the view of the user, trying to figure out ways that we could really support mission priorities. Some of the ones that we've looked at Zero Trust as an enabler for would be our data center migration, some of the different aspects of integrations that we're working with partners, different areas where we've got NGOs, non-governmental organizations that we're working with, where we can put a lot better protections in place and sometimes give access to things we weren't comfortable doing without a Zero Trust. A Zero Trust architecture in place. The place where I see some challenges and where we're looking at some of the challenging aspects, I don't want to put it on people, process, or technology, but I do want to say it is the mindset, it is the idea, the culture of where Zero Trust plays and how it plays. We've got to think about security differently. We don't have walls of security that we can rely on. We don't have these sort of blockers, right? So an application owner can't just guarantee that if an authentication to the application is correct, that they're good. They've got to build those escalation mechanisms in. They've got to build in, policy engines, policy enforcement, policy decisions into the application space, which is a very new thing to think about, if you're an application owner. And then, one of the other areas is just having people think about where and how we evaluate risk when they're making decisions about security. Risk is something we all think about. We think about when we're getting an ATO. We think about it when we're evaluating a capability early on. But sometimes we stop thinking about that risk in those areas.
Thank you. Dan, do you have an opinion you'd like to share?
I'm very similar to Eric. So Eric and I were fortunate enough to work together in Adobe for quite a long time. So I was part of the Zero Trust story in Adobe and now at Cisco. And in both cases, the people process technology thing, the people piece, we're making it easier for the users. We've done a really great job in the team in Adobe, and we've done a great job in Cisco. But the security professionals behind the scene, the application people, as Brian say, they're the ones that you've got to get their mindset around that shift, because they can't realize and get their head around the fact that we're not going to have users use VPN, and they're thinking, well, we're going to be less secure. And it's actually, no, we're going to be more secure, because we're going to do some things like the security intelligence that Stephen talked about, the data lake, using that anomalous events and taking that information, getting rid of passwords and using certificates. So there's a whole bunch of things we're going to do to make the user's life better. But the security professional behind the scenes, they start getting really nervous because they think we're becoming reckless. But you do need many things. And I think of this as about being able to move security to be something which is, not seen and not heard, but really, really in your face. I mean, so basically the users don't know it's in their face because we're using the data, we're using the information, and we're using the telemetry from the devices, and we're really bringing that all together. So I do kind of go back to as Eric said at the start, trust but verify. We don't trust anything, but we use all the information from everything that we get, from the endpoint to the user to the authentication to the app, and you bring that information together. And you can make some magic happen without being too intrusive. So for me, the people piece is easy for users, hard for the back end. The tech piece is incredibly hard if you don't have a good identity program or a good endpoint security to start with. Then you're behind the 8 ball to begin with. And as Eric said, the process is, you got to figure out some really process challenges as you want to look at what do you do for anomalous events, or what do you do if you see some behavior coming in from some bad country.
So speaking of being behind the 8 ball, the president's executive order on improving cybersecurity asked agencies to submit plans, and rather quickly, for implementing a zero trust architecture. What advice would you give those organizations that are just starting their zero trust journey? Stephen?
Yeah, first and foremost, take inventory of what you have. You may have more than you know. That's the key. And don't look for that just in your CIO's office. You need to be talking to your chief data officer. You need to be talking to also, in some cases, even folks like HR, when we start talking about behavioral records and identity information. The second part of that is when we look at the executive order, you'll see that there's some pieces that tie into what I just spoke about. This need for really strong multi-factor authentication, this need for having logs in one place. Well, that's data lake, that's ICAM. But there's also allusions to some of the other kind of interim steps on your way to zero trust, things like secure access service edge, or SASE, that's the Gartner term for it, where we're actually divorcing ourselves from the idea of like a physical tie cap and moving the idea of a secure interconnect for all of our traffic into the cloud, which is awesome because now we get the elasticity and all the benefits that the cloud can provide, including the agility of the cloud. And then finally, I think the last space is really around this idea of SOAR, security, orchestration, automation, and response, and making sure, it's been mentioned a couple times now, and that's great, that we have to be able to respond and execute when we do see things with all this data that we have. And it needs to be the right thing, because all it takes is a couple false positives with the wrong folks or the right folks in your organization, and the confidence in the zero trust program will implode on itself, and you'll be fighting a political battle versus, hey, let's actually fight the real bad people who are trying to get into our enterprise.
Brian?
Yeah, I mean, I think Stephen's on point. I will actually say I am glad that we got the EO out there. I'm glad that it referenced zero trust because it's really brought zero trust into the lexicon. DHS, we got started on zero trust very early. So, we've certainly been working with some of our peer departments to try and get them more information, trying to share a lot of the assets that we've developed. We've also been working across all of the components of DHS to do that. But I will say, since the EO came out and since the implementation plan was required in the EO, I've gotten a lot of calls from other CTOs across the federal landscape with a lot of interest. So first off, I really do appreciate that. I think that's good, getting that lexicon out there, getting folks thinking about it, and kind of having that nudge to start on the journey. As far as advice goes, I definitely tell people to think about what are your use cases, where can you make prioritize your use cases by where you can make a real impact in your security. Looking at something like MITRE's attack framework is a great place to start. Figuring out what are you concerned with, what what activities do you have going on where, risk might be significant or where you want to impact your risk? And then the other is figuring out where you've got correlations with other activities. When we started at DHS, we started with looking at things like CASB, Cloud Access Security Broker, and Cloud Security Gateway, because we were moving to a data center. We were closing down one of our data centers, moving a lot of assets to the cloud. So we saw a great opportunity to really impact those activities with Zero Trust while giving us a good impetus to get our Zero Trust activities going. And the other one I would say is reach out to peers and partners, right? We all have lots of partners that we can work with. We all have lots of peers in our government agencies. Lots of folks are just getting started with Zero Trust, so you're likely to find some really good compatriots that are either with you or maybe a little bit ahead of you, and I think we're all willing to help.
Eric, any advice for folks just getting started that we haven't already covered?
I think the other one, kind of dovetailing into what Brian was saying, is also just get started doing something, because I think it can be daunting if you look at it. It's not an on-off switch. It's an incremental. You start, at a foundation of with IAM and maybe endpoint security and start building on it. And one of the things Ben and I have advocated over the years is, if you look across your organization, odds are you have most of the components already running in different segments. The key is how do you then link them together so they're aware of each other and build those integrations and the intelligence to make those decisions and leverage things like the data lakes and user behavior and those types of things. So my big advice is get started incrementally and don't think you have to go out and just find this behemoth solution to just turn on. You probably can make some big inroads quickly just looking across your landscape.
Low-hanging fruit. Yeah,
yep.
Big rocks first. That's what we heard, I think, from you and Brian. Common theme there. We have a question that's come in. A large obstacle we see is the ability to provide ubiquitous Zero Trust access across the disparate environments, on-prem, multiple cloud vendors, etc. A follow-on comment would be extending Zero Trust as mergers and acquisitions occur. Thoughts on how to tackle these fundamental issues? Den, what do you think?
Yeah, so following on, well, there's two things there, right? So there's a merger and acquisition, not connecting networks. In Adobe, we were really fortunate to have several mergers and acquisitions go through during our time of our early Zero Trust adoption, and it was really exciting because we had the applications made available via the internet. You didn't need to connect the networks, and people could still access the applications. So provided that their endpoint and their identity met our minimum bar, then they could definitely do that. I'd love to follow on from the other point about the technology stack. I don't think there's one vendor that can do this end to end. In Adobe, as you heard, we had best breed technologies, and we leveraged those. And I was fortunate when I joined Cisco that we had the Duo product, and the Duo product met almost all of our needs, but it still didn't get the last mile of the edge, right? So the reality is there's different vendors will tell you they can all do it. The reality is you have what you have, and you're not going to just scrap all your investments for the last X number of years to go buy this product X. So it's now about bringing products together that are best of breed or that you already have. And for me personally, that's how we first of all met the IDSA team. That's what inspired us to participate, because we really needed vendors to work together. So for me, that is really the most important part of this, is you can't just scrap your stuff. And if you do this right, you don't necessarily need to join the networks to enable access to apps and services when you do M&As. It's a great use case. So for us in both of those scenarios, we had a win-win story. I mean, there was nothing negative about it. And if you don't mind, one thing I'll close on, Eric and I used to tell people this one thing: we do not need to ask permission to improve the authentication experience. We were in charge of authentication. So in order to do this better, we could divert the authentication, do the posture check, bring it back, and then get you in. We didn't need to ask permission if you don't want to enter your password again, or you don't want to VPN in. So the reality is if you've got the identity stack in your space and your control, you don't need to ask permission to improve that experience. And while improving that experience, you can take steps along this path. It's pretty straightforward.
Zero trust, improved experience, and cost savings. My mind is completely blown here today. Stephen, would you like to add to that?
Well, I think Dan nailed a lot of it. If I had to add anything, it's as we're building systems, and from a security perspective, we don't often think of this, but it's so vitally important. We need to make sure we're pushing for open interoperable standards. And so when we're talking about things like authentication, we need to be talking about, say, OAuth, for example, and making sure that as we build a new platform, as we're bringing platforms on or modernizing, that we're leveraging that type of the standard. So we become more modular. We become more plug and play in terms of how we can bring services in and out. The second part is really taking advantage of some of the new formats and new standards around machine-to-machine exchange of information, like OSCAL, the open source control assessment language. The promise of OSCAL is we get rid of system security plans, these 500 to 1,000 page binders, and we replace it with, here's the service provider, their control information in OSCAL format, here's your governance risk compliance tool picking it up and then ingesting it and using some of this AI, AML to understand, well, what is the risk of that system at that moment? You do that in a zero trust environment, things get really cool in a hurry.
We've had another question come in. Are PIV or CAC cards barriers to implementing zero trust, or are they capable of doing the advanced authentication methods in the executive order? Brian, you want to take that one first?
Sure. Yeah. And actually, before I do that, I do want to hit, I think Steve nailed it at the end. That idea of moving your policy enforcement, your policy decisions into an automated space, leveraging the data that Eric was talking about. Those are really where you get to seeing the value of zero trust. So just wanted to foot stomp that one time because I think that is the holy grail that we're all trying to get to. That is where you really start to see security, major improvements in security. On PIV and CAC, we're still using PIV and CAC. I don't think the government is going to move off of PIV and CAC anytime soon. I think there was a lot of thought as to how that plays within the authentication, the identity mechanisms in the EO. I'm not sure what's meant by the advanced authentication methods. I mean, we're doing plenty of escalation. We're looking at augmenting identity providers, augmenting authentication providers, how we're doing escalation. We're doing all of that with PIV and CAC. I do think that there are some gaps. There are opportunities for a better than PIV and CAC. But I mean, even if you look at what industry's doing with, security keys, building security chips into devices these days, they're doing the same things as what we're seeing with PIV and CAC, right? You're looking for an encrypted mechanism that can give you an identity, encrypt traffic, provide you with keys. And PIV and CAC are good opportunities to do that. So I do think they can be done. When you have opportunities for some other mechanisms, if you're outside the government and if you're working on your corporate network, those sorts of things, sure, there are some other opportunities to do some more interesting things. But I don't see PIV and CAC changing even with the requirements of the EO.
Anybody else have a comment they want to share?
If I can just jump in on a few quick things, I don't think we're going to see those going away because while we focus on some of the how cumbersome PIV can be, especially in terms of authentication, we also use it for physical access to our buildings. So we're going to be issuing something in terms of physical access to the building. And well, why not combine it all into one? Issue one unit instead of multiple units that you now have to track. That's part of the thinking behind it. Two, I think we're going to see a big push in the near future around phishing resistant authenticators. And that means moving away from things like SMS or even token on the phone where you get your 6 digits on the phone, moving away from that style of authentication to truly something you have or something you are. And there are ways where we can do that, where we move away from the PIV. We can derive credentials from the PIV and use different fobs and tokens and things like that. But I think there's always going to have to be some type of token or something in the mix. Physically is the strongest way to do it. And PIV is something that here again, all the agencies have it. We're all doing it. So for the near future, I would say you're going to see probably more PIV, not less, in terms of the discussion around zero trust. But then, you know, when I talk to my peer CISOs, there is a very healthy discussion around what are those alternative authenticators that I can derive from the PIV that I might be able to use in some situations that are more user-friendly.
So we've had a good question come in about legacy. Any practical implementation stories or gotchas on securing legacy tech using the zero trust approach? Dan, how about you?
Yeah, so legacy for me, Adobe and Cisco, there's a couple of issues here, right? One is there's legacy applications that don't follow the protocols that your reverse proxy might follow and use in order to deliver service. So a lot of the zero trust reverse proxy technologies, they're going to really focus on web-based protocols as opposed to other things that might use APIs or old, thick client applications. So there are some challenges there when you're looking at the reverse proxy, which is how do you get borderless rather than using VPN as the proxy, you use something else. So that thing supports so many protocols. You might want to do your homework and go back to, I think Stephen mentioned this earlier about know what you've got, know what you're dealing with. That's one of those things where that know what you got really is helpful, right? The other thing is I don't think of this as legacy, but I think of this as another challenge similar to legacy, which is you're not in control of everybody's endpoint device. If you're working with vendors, third-party companies, it might be the case that you don't have control there. So you might want to use VDI solutions or something else in order for them to connect to a trusted endpoint that might be a virtual endpoint that you supply, and you're streaming applications via that mechanism. So those are the two biggest gotchas that I've seen before, continue to see now.
Anybody else have anything they'd like to share?
Yeah, I think I would just dovetail on what Den said too. The other thing is kind of going all the way back to process too. It's really, if you have legacy applications or tools in your environment, working with, whether it's the application or service owners, with the vendor team, of understanding what's the path to modernizing those platforms. Some of them we know, hey, maybe they're end of life or they're always going to have legacy, and so you do quarantine those, and maybe those are the things that stay traditional and secure them the old-fashioned way. But the real push is how do we get those platforms updated, modernized, that support the zero trust architectures and the modern ways to secure or authenticate.
And I think I'll add one more onto that as we think about zero trust and legacy. Legacy, you really got two options. You can modernize, and that's saying we're going to take something that maybe was on mainframes and figure out how do we put it in a leading cloud provider using the native capabilities that are in that cloud provider. Those are big shifts, but necessary if you ever hope to kind of dig out of that legacy type of environment. The other thing you do is you treat it almost like a container. You figure out where you draw the lines around it from a security perimeter, and then you treat that perimeter as if it were one of the pieces in your zero trust model. But you treat it much like you would treat a container in Docker or Kubernetes or whatever. Input, output over this boundary, and the whole unit itself is now more of a modern approach. And most of the folks that are in the zero trust space have what they call connectors or adapters, whatever you call it. And you basically bolt that on to that boundary and treat it like a container within the zero trust space. Not ideal, completely bolting on security, but you can do it, and it buys you a bridge and it buys you time so that you can then optimize and move into a more modern type of operation.
Another audience question, please keep them coming. Is there anyone who has solved the automation problem to orchestrate policy enforcement required to enable zero trust? Brian, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I think so. That kind of gets back to what Steve and I were talking about, right? Really getting to where policies are based off of data, right? So, orchestrating your policies, having your applications be aware of the values and data that they can use to make a decision on access. Those are really where we're starting to focus. Within DHS, really what we're trying to do is we're trying to get our application owners to start thinking about, rather than authentication, login-based application security, really think about it at the request level. Think about the data that they're exposing and the methods by which they're combining data to be able to make the decisions. I think the orchestration piece of it is really cool because then you can start to do some really nice escalation things. You can start to think about where your users are leveraging data. There's lots of insights that can be derived from that. We can start making much smarter decisions. And then I think where that really hits home is like I talked about at the very beginning, right? We deal with a lot of non-governmental organizations. We deal with some foreign countries, some peers and partners where we may not have been we may not have been comfortable sharing information before when it was system level access. But now that we can control the down to the data point, we can actually catalog data and understand the risk and implication of sharing that data. Sometimes we can make decisions where we would be more comfortable and making sort of the risk-based decision on whether that data can be shared. So it really comes down to, though, you've got to go a layer deeper than the network and access. You've really got to be thinking about the data, and that is difficult. That's a long-term effort. You've got to catalog your data. You've got to understand the risk that your data provides, and you've got to be in sync with your privacy folks, for your privacy impact analysis, your business impact analysis, and really understanding how your data is moving through your application. So it's difficult, but there are a lot of opportunities there.
So we talked earlier about people, process, technology, and culture, which is kind of in the people bucket. Well, we've had somebody come in a question come in. This person says, I am battling cultural blocks, roadblocks, I imagine. Is there any reason not to move incrementally to zero trust when you get pushback on we don't need any more security? Any lessons on helping move the cultural change conversation along? And we've hit on this a little bit already, but I want to pursue this a little bit further because I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of people who can identify with this question. Who wants to go first? Dan, how about you?
So earlier we mentioned about the not asking someone if they'd like us to improve their experience. So I think that the first thing is figure out who you're having these conversations with, because you don't have to tell someone they don't need to log in as many times, and you don't have to tell anyone you're replacing their username and password with a certificate. You don't need to tell anyone they don't need to VPN in. And I'll share this story with you. When Eric and I were doing Zero Trust in Adobe many years ago now, we had a user reach out to our security organization and log that they had been doing some research, and they had discovered that they could access applications that were previously internal without having to go via VPN. And this eventually obviously hit us, and we were like, we've Zero Trust enabled that application, and that user has an endpoint which meets the criteria and has all the protections. And we forgot to memo everybody, because you don't want to tell 40,000 people or 100,000 people that they don't need to take no action. So I think the cultural thing is about who are you having the cultural conversation with, and what is their motivator and intent behind the conversation, and then realize how do you twist that is really striking it for them, because you might find that they're the app guy, they're the security person, they're not the end user. Because I promise you, if you go ask an end user if they'd like their life to be easier, I don't know what their answer is. They'd probably say, no, I'd like to log in 20 times more today. Is that okay? So the reality is it's who are you having the cultural conversation with, that organizational change piece, and what's their motivator. Once you know their motivator, then you can adjust the conversation.
Steve, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, no, there's a great quote. I have no idea who said it, but it's the quote goes like this: "Security is always too much until the moment it's not enough." And that's really what we're talking about here. And so much of this boils down to awareness and making sure folks understand that our adversaries are advancing, they're evolving every moment, and that we have to build the castle right. Every brick, every piece of mortar, every nail has to be in the right place. They have to find one loose brick. They have to find one nail that's sticking out that they can pull on. And so it's two completely different worlds. And I think about two events in this regard. And if your leadership doesn't know certainly about the first event, it's time to have that conversation. And the first one is, of course, SolarWinds. If you did everything right, you were compromised. You kept your system up to date. You used signed packages. You patched. You got owned. Now, if you have zero trust, all of a sudden your SolarWinds box is reaching out and doing things it normally hasn't. You detect it and like, whoa, hang on. The AI ML is telling me something's very off here. We need to go see what's happening. Why is this SolarWinds box reaching out to this area where it's never done that before? You have an early lead and an early start. But if you don't keep investing, you don't put that technology in place, you're a sitting duck. The other piece is just recently there was an article in ARS Technica that talks about how a red team exploited a trusted platform module, which is a small chip on a laptop or a desktop that basically holds the keys to the kingdom. And here again, the chip was designed beautifully. Nanometer sized leads, if you tried to break it open, it'll self-destruct, etc. But one critical design flaw: the serial interface connected to another chip with big fat juicy pins that you could hook onto and basically read everything from the chip and grab the keys. Here again, technology advances. People get smarter about how to hook into things. If we're not evolving at the same pace, we're going to get caught and we're going to get owned. So there's an awareness campaign, a little bit of cultural campaign, and then finally, I love Den's comment about understand the mission and the mission impact. So what if the TPM gets compromised? What does that mean? Well, now an adversary can get access to all 7 million records, and we're up on the hill and we're paying big fines and we've lost public trust. That's why the TPM matters. We got to be able to connect those dots.
There's a question that came in earlier today before the webinars. Nice to see people that are excited and looking forward to things and submitted their question in advance. Zero Trust is a multi-year effort and requires implementing many security projects and developing policies around them. In your experience, how do you prioritize implementation efforts, given that there is not always enough budget? I don't think there's ever enough budget to implement all the required projects to reach a certain maturity and capability level. Eric, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. I would kind of go back to what we were talking about earlier about start small, get the blocking and tackling in place, take advantage of some of the things you're already doing right, whether it's around your IAM platform, your authentication platform, turn on things like Den mentioned. We don't have to ask people, they don't want to enter passwords. So implement, cert-based or passwordless types of auth. And then under the hood, start doing some things to take advantage of the security postures you can use in those situations. I think the other part is, I just lost my train of thought. So I'll let somebody else go while I get it back.
Who wants to chime in? Den?
So actually, I'll jump in. I guess if from a budget perspective, I think that is always something that we have to deal with on the government side. What we did was exactly what Eric said. We started small. We started with where we knew we could make impacts. We tried to get the organization involved, and through truly making risk-based impacts, I think we've been able to make the case for more budget. We've been able to understand how we can adjust our security posture, maybe looking at other security areas where you might have an investment that's a couple years out that you can pull forward. Again, once you can show how you're making an impact, once you can show how you're reducing risk, sometimes areas where budget can be available sometimes start to show up, and it makes it a lot easier when you have to go to leadership, even to the Hill, to OMB, and let them know. I mean, we saw that with some of the funding areas that came with the cyber EO. those that were putting together strong capability statements for what they wanted to do from a cyber perspective were able to get a little bit of extra money from them.
Yeah, and I'll just jump back in, Brian. That's exactly where I was going with it too. It's like it's taking your current investments and building on those, having those small successes, building some confidence in what you're doing. Then exactly, you can go back and say, hey, just for a few bucks more, I can build this piece onto it. And then you build that success, and then you can ask for a few bucks more. So there's a lot of situations where you can just incrementally do it. And then you can be talking kind of larger strategy down the road and say, now that we've pulled this off, how about a larger investment where we then start shifting everything into where we want to be and have that roadmap in place. But you've got the senior leaders behind you because they've seen some successes, and maybe you've captured some of the things Stephen talked about. You see the anomalous behavior, and it's like, hey, if we hadn't done this, this is what would have happened. So look what we've done, great. And at the same time, you've got your users having a better experience and they're more secure. So you kind of are burning it, or you're tackling it on both ends and kind of feeding the system off of each other.
Yeah, and so the Adobe, the initial investment, we actually, first of all, we absorbed it within our budget, but we spent $240,000 and we incremented our staff by 1. So we deployed this to 40,000 people using the existing investments and then a little bit more. And as Eric said, there's nothing better than saying, first of all, we know you don't like VPNing in, so we already took care of that business. We took care of your password thing. You're not doing passwords really much any longer. Oh, and then secondly, did you really log in from Zimbabwe last week on a Windows computer? Because we know you're a Mac person. So how did that play out? So when you go to the executives and say, was that really you? Because we saw someone try to log in as you. Now we took action on your behalf, so you didn't need to worry about it. But it's great when you have that, and then as Eric says, then you follow up. It's there's always that drug analogy that people would say, like you'd give the people drugs for free, and then you'd get them hooked, and you want to pay for it. Now I'll equate that to candy and coffee because that's mine. But if you give me coffee for free at Starbucks or Pete's, I'm going to go in there and then I'm going to get it after that, and now I'll have to start paying for it now because I just can't get away from those laddies, right? So it's you got to go in there with a really simple mindset of leveraging what you have, small incremental, without spending really much money. I mean, how can you do this on a budget? We're not all like Google, right? So we didn't have the Google budget. Then once they see the power of it and you give them more roadmap, then I think people want to invest in that.
Dan and Eric, I think if you ever get tired of cybersecurity, there's careers for you in sales and marketing, because that's what you just described.
Yeah, I think a lot of this stuff is sales. A lot of it's sales and marketing. You have to go to those around you. That culture thing earlier, it's all sales and marketing. You've got to tell them how the carrot is going to taste better than the stick, and it's wonderful. Join us to Nirvana. That's where we're going. And I was really blessed because the team at Adobe done a great job of that. I mean, I'm only one kid, right? So I wasn't the only one going around beating the drum. There was a lot of people in the team that was always saying this is great, including my boss, our CSO and our CIO. They were championing that because they loved what they were getting. It's a really good story if you make it easier and the user experience is better.
Well, and I'll just add one more piece to that, to the sales and marketing. We branded our program Zero Trust Enterprise Network, or Zen. So it was always talking about what's the Zen state. And so you could, for the folks listening, you can go up and do a search on Adobe and Zen, and you can see our white papers and all the stuff we talked about. But it was, we branded it intentionally into something that people would want and want to get to. And that helped us just kind of build a brand around it.
That's fantastic. I as a former CMO, I didn't think my expertise was going to be relevant on this panel, but that's great. So we've talked a little bit about getting started and prioritizing. Let's talk a little bit about how do you know when you're done? How do you know when you're done implementing a zero trust architecture? What are some of the essential measures of merit that would validate a zero trust architecture? What are your senior leaders looking for in Zero Trust? Brian, do you want to start for us?
Sure. I don't think you're ever done, just like security, right? When we think about, even POAMs, right? When we're thinking about just security controls, you're always updating your security controls. You're always adding new controls. So I don't think we're ever done, but I do think, going back to the topic that we've talked about before, I do think there are levels of maturity and there's stages that you should be trying to progress through. That's really how we've looked at it. We've built sort of 5 levels of maturity for the department to go through to reach what we're calling a fully mature Zero Trust implementation. I do think it's important to think about it as a journey. I do think it's important to think about it as a continuum, because if you start to think about it in terms of, okay, so we've got identity done, we've completed our identity journey. As Stephen and Eric have both mentioned, the bad actors are always finding new ways. They're always going to find that one thing that's wrong. We've always got to be adaptive. And I think most security professionals understand that. Security is an adaptive profession. It is an absolutely adaptive art form. The other piece, though, I will say is I think you've got to have, and something we haven't talked about yet, is you've got to have visibility baked into Zero Trust. We talk about policies. We talk about where those policies need to live, how application developers need to be thinking about those policies. But one thing that's super important as you're thinking about your journey, as you're getting into higher levels of maturity, is visibility has to be a part of that. We've taken on, combining our network operations center and our SOC, our security operations center, into a single place so that we can bring those visibility and, ideas together. We can have that full visibility into everything. And then that lets us actually do some objective evaluations of where we are with it. So I think, definitely consider Zero Trust as a continuum. Consider it a journey. Do try to give yourself goals along the way, but understand you're always going to be having to improve security, and make sure you've got the right metrics, visibility, and measurables to see where you stand.
Anybody want to add to that? Well, you mentioned developers, I think, Brian, and we have a question about our brethren on the application development side of the house, software engineers. What do application developers need to know about Zero Trust? Who wants to take that? Stephen, you're shaking your head.
Yeah, I'll start that one. It's 2 things. One, your Zero Trust brothers and sisters are hungry for data. So as you're building that application, start thinking about, how can I get information about behavior, especially login, log off, data access, and then other logs? How can I get them out? And how can I make sure I've got an API or some type of format that I can get that data out, in my case, like into my data lake, because that's where I want it. The second piece is, how well can my policy engine or my trust engine in Zero Trust, how well can it effectuate control within your software? So here again, you send me logs, I bump them up against a bunch of other stuff that I'm getting from crazy places that says, that's a bad IP, and we've already seen other attempts with that particular identity. You need to restrict that account now. Right now, if that happens, it's typically someone picking up the phone, calling an admin and saying, stop that account. But that needs to be automated. So you need to have a way whereby we can get hooks in, and especially around account control or access to data, we can effectuate that from the Zero Trust policy engine.
So I want to jump in too, because I think so Stephen hit on 2 good points, and I want to add a third. I think the other one is that we have to stop thinking about the entirety of identity living within the application, right? So one place that I have seen a lot, especially, and this gets into a little bit of the legacy apps, is they own identity, they own the attributes, they own the criteria. That's got to go away. That's got to be one of the first things that goes away, because you've got to be in the enterprise identity store. You've got to be leveraging the attributes, the same attributes that your policy enforcement is using, and you've got to be able to take inputs that can come from that policy enforcement. So to me, it's about sort of 3 things. Applications starting to think about the attributes that are important to them, how they want to evaluate them, integrating with the enterprise identity, and then being able to take sort of authentication, authorization, and identity decisions from an external source rather than having to make those decisions themselves.
And I would throw in one more kind of use case or a real world example for that. I think that everything that Brian and Stephen said would be true. is in a true zero trust, you're not only looking at the user, but you're looking at the device. And so traditionally, when we see that behavior, we'd go in and disable that account, which means that person can't do their work anywhere anymore. With the zero trust space, you have capability of, if we have these devices, you could go in and terminate just the accounts or the sessions in that application alone. You also have the ability to do it on a per device basis. You know, if they've got a Mac and Windows and they were seeing activity on the Mac that could be bad behavior, we could stop that device and kill its sessions, but let them continue on their other device while that's being investigated. So it adds this level of capabilities, but to Stephen's point, you've got to have those hooks. The app developers have to build in the capabilities for other applications to go in, which I think, you know, I'll turn this back into a marketing call, is for the IDSA. That's part of the reasons that is really compelling there, is getting these vendors to look at a common framework so we can integrate and have those connections and make developers aware of those needs as they build their applications and have those plugs in there.
Well, and if you haven't shut me down completely and I can still get some work done, then we're also talking about a better user experience again, right? Let's wrap up with a final word from everybody on what's your one piece of advice, boil the ocean a little bit, one piece of advice for organizations that are just getting started on their zero trust journey. Dan, let's start with you.
So it's a journey, or as I like to say, an adventure, and start with, you know, the authentication experience, because if you start there, that gets them all excited when you make that better, and then you just keep it moving.
Eric, how about you?
Kind of what I've been saying all along is just find something and start, whether it's IAM's the great place to start, but start somewhere. And don't sit there and think it's a big switch to turn on.
Don't let perfection be the enemy of good. Just get started.
Exactly.
Stephen?
I couldn't agree more. In fact, we started primarily with the data lake, and then we matured and built out identity and other pieces. So just start somewhere. Also, you know, you need to make sure that you can demonstrate that value. We've talked about that a lot today. But if you can't answer in 5 minutes how you bought down risk with your investment this year, you need to get that speech ready, because those are the type of things that enable you to get more funding and get plugged into other opportunities for funding, like other system modernization, where you can say, hey, I can modernize authentication there and add ZTA, but you need to fund me too. Working with the business partners and building those relationships is going to be crucial for success going forward. And I really appreciate the questions today. I've learned a lot from folks, and I want to thank everybody for their time.
Brian?
Yeah, I will say that as well. Great questions. It's been a really entertaining conversation. I really appreciate the other panelists. I have also learned a couple of things. I would say, you know, start your zero trust journey by being practical, by being pragmatic. Don't be afraid to get started. Don't be afraid to start small, and then just make sure that you're always improving something, either improving the user experience, improving the security posture, or reducing risk for the organization. And you can't go wrong. I mean, there's just so many options out there to take on zero trust. Everybody should be able to find one that they can do. And you know, we did it in 90 and 120-day sprints. So, you know, just get started. Don't be afraid of it. It is approachable when you break it down.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you, all of you, for participating today. This was a great conversation. And now I'm going to throw it back to Julie, I believe.
Yes, great. You guys, thanks so much for participating. I want to thank Lisa for moderating the customer panel and Jerry for moderating our technical panel. They were fantastic discussions, I think, provided lots of guidance and insight for organizations, whether in the public or private sector, on where to get started and how to succeed with zero trust and in their journey. Just also want to say that the recording will be available, so please share with colleagues who might have been unable to attend. And the engagement on LinkedIn has been fantastic. The questions, as mentioned, have been fantastic. So please continue to engage on LinkedIn as part of the event conversation. And if you haven't followed the National Cybersecurity Alliance, the IDSA, or NIST on LinkedIn, please do that as well. And then lastly, I just want to say on behalf of the Identity Defined Security Alliance, the National Cybersecurity Alliance, and NIST, NCCOE, thanks so much for joining us today. Thanks, and have a great day.